In 1971, 24-year-old Vera Dunning stood in the freezing mud of her Vermont farmstead and stared at the wrong bull. The diesel engine of the livestock hauler idled loudly, sending thick plumes of gray exhaust into the crisp autumn air, while the driver leaned against the aluminum rails of the trailer, chewing on a matchstick and holding a clipboard. Vera had spent the last of her operating loan, a sum that had kept her awake for 3 consecutive weeks, on a premium, registered Hereford bull from the most prestigious auction house in the state. She had purchased a creature that was supposed to be the salvation of her struggling herd, an animal with a pedigree longer than her own family tree, boasting a broad chest, a blocky frame, and genetics guaranteed to produce heavy, fast-growing calves. But the animal standing at the bottom of the loading ramp, blinking slowly at the gray Vermont sky, was not a premium Hereford. It was a mistake. The bull before her was plain, narrow in the hips, and possessed a rough, almost primitive coat that looked more like dirty wool than the sleek hair of a modern beef animal. He was not blocky or heavily muscled. Instead, he had a long, angular face, a thick and prehistoric brow, and a frame that seemed built out of spare, hard angles rather than the soft, fleshy curves the meat industry currently demanded. He looked like an artifact, something pulled from a forgotten century, entirely out of place in the modern era of scientific agriculture. The driver checked his clipboard, confirmed the lot number stapled to the animal's right ear, and shrugged. The tag matched the paperwork, but the animal attached to the tag was undeniably, laughably wrong. Somewhere in the chaotic holding pens of the auction yard, a gate had been left open, a tag had been swapped, and the premium Hereford Vera had paid for was likely on its way to a commercial feedlot, while this unwanted, unregistered cast-off had been shipped to the Green Mountains. Vera walked into the farmhouse, her boots leaving heavy tracks of mud across the faded linoleum, and dialed the number for the auction house. When Mr. Halloway, the head auctioneer and owner of the establishment, finally came to the phone, his voice was thick with the patronizing tone reserved for young women trying to make a living in a man's world. Vera explained the situation, her voice steady and precise, detailing the physical discrepancies between the animal she had purchased and the animal standing in her holding pen. Mr. Halloway let out a long, wheezing laugh that crackled over the telephone wire. He admitted that there had been a mix-up in the staging area, a careless error by a new handler. He told her the bull she had received was a scrub, a local surrender with no papers, no known pedigree, and no commercial value. It was an animal destined for the local slaughterhouse, a creature nobody wanted. Mr. Halloway offered to send the truck back the next morning. He promised to refund her money in full, though he noted with a chuckle that her original premium Hereford was already halfway to a corporate ranch in New York State and could not be retrieved. He told her to just keep the scrub fed for the night, and they would correct the paperwork in the morning. He spoke to her as if she were a child who had accidentally purchased the wrong color of ribbon at a general store. He expected her to be grateful for the refund, to apologize for the inconvenience, and to quietly wait for the truck. But Vera did not say she was grateful. She stood in the dim light of her kitchen, the telephone pressed hard against her ear, looking out the window at the holding pen where the strange, angular bull was methodically inspecting the perimeter of the wooden fence. She told Mr. Halloway she was keeping the bull. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then the auctioneer laughed again, louder this time, a sound full of genuine amusement and deep-seated arrogance. He asked her if she had lost her mind, reminding her that the animal had no registered bloodline, no predictable growth metrics, and absolutely no resale value. He warned her that breeding her cows to a scrub would ruin her calf crop for the year, bankrupting her small operation before the snow even melted. The men gathered in the auction house office, who could undoubtedly hear Mr. Halloway broadcasting the conversation, were likely laughing as well. They were men who traded cattle by the hundreds, Men who believed entirely in the modern science of maximum weight and rapid growth, and they believed they knew exactly what they were witnessing. The final, foolish mistake of a young woman who had no business running a farm. Vera listened to the laughter, politely declined the refund, hung up the heavy black receiver, and walked back out into the cold. Let me explain the world Vera Dunning was trying to survive in. The early 1970s were a time of rapid, ruthless modernization in American agriculture. The industry was obsessed with size and speed. The conventional wisdom dictated that cattle needed to be massive, fed on heavy grain rations, and pushed to slaughter weight as quickly as possible. The old ways of farming, where cattle were expected to forage on marginal land, survive harsh winters without expensive supplements, and calve unassisted in the brush, were considered obsolete. The local farmers and ranchers in the Green Mountains, men who had known Vera since she was a little girl in pigtails, had all embraced this new philosophy. They borrowed heavily from the local bank to buy massive, genetically modified bulls. They poured chemical fertilizers onto their pastures, and they built expensive, heated barns to protect their delicate, over-muscled animals from the brutal Vermont winters. They were deeply in debt, but they were following the advice of the experts, the universities, and the auction houses. Vera was entirely alone in this landscape. She had inherited the farm 3 years earlier after the passing of her grandfather, Elias Dunning. The farm was small, the soil was rocky and unforgiving, and the bank held a mortgage that felt like a storm cloud permanently settled over the roof of the house. She had no husband to share the labor, no brothers to run the tractors, and no financial safety net to catch her if she failed. The neighbors watched her with a mixture of pity and condescension. They stopped their pickup trucks by her fence line to offer unsolicited advice, suggesting she sell the land to a developer or liquidate the herd and find a job in town. They saw her as a tragic figure, stubbornly clinging to a failing enterprise out of misplaced sentimentality. When word spread through the county that she had accepted a worthless scrub bull instead of taking a cash refund from Mr. Holloway, the whispers grew louder. They concluded that the strain of the debt had finally broken her common sense. But the neighbors did not know about the journals. Elias Dunning had been a quiet, solitary man who trusted the land far more than he trusted the words of salesmen or agricultural experts. He had farmed through the Great Depression, through droughts and blizzards, and he had survived because he understood that nature does not reward greed, it rewards endurance. He had spent his entire life observing cattle, not as commodities to be weighed on a scale, but as biological machines designed to convert sunlight and grass into life. Over the course of 50 years, he had filled dozens of thick, leather-bound journals with his observations. These books were not mere ledgers of profit and loss. They were a master class in ancestral wisdom, a meticulous record of anatomy, behavior, and survival. When Vera was a child, she did not play with dolls. She sat at the heavy oak table in the kitchen, watching her grandfather draw detailed anatomical sketches of cattle under the warm glow of a kerosene lamp. He taught her how to look past the fat and the flesh to see the underlying architecture of the animal. He explained that a modern heavy-muscled bull might look impressive in a show ring, but its massive size required enormous amounts of expensive grain to maintain, and its narrow pelvic structure often led to disastrous, fatal complications during calving. He taught her to look for the traits of the old, forgotten breeds, the animals that had walked across continents, survived famines, and thrived on nothing but tough grass and clean water. He taught her to look for depth of rib, which indicated a massive lung capacity and a strong heart. He taught her to look for the angle of the shoulder, which dictated how easily the animal could walk miles for water. He taught her to look for a specific, intelligent calmness in the eye, a temperament that meant the animal would not waste precious energy fighting the world. Now let me tell you what Vera saw when she stood in the freezing mud and looked at the wrong bull. She did not see a worthless scrub. She saw the physical manifestation of her grandfather's journals. As the bull moved along the fence line, She noticed the perfect, effortless articulation of its joints. It did not lumber or waddle like the heavy modern cattle. It walked with the fluid, predatory grace of a wild animal. She observed the tremendous depth of its rib cage, a barrel built to process massive amounts of rough, low-quality forage. She saw the wide, square set of its jaw, designed for tearing tough brush when the soft grass was buried under snow. And most importantly, she saw the bone structure. The bull possessed a wide, sloping pelvic geometry that the modern industry had completely bred out of their cattle in their quest for square, blocky hindquarters. Vera knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this animal was not a random mutation or a useless cast-off. It was a genetic time capsule. It carried a heritage bloodline, an ancient configuration of DNA that the commercial industry had been unknowingly destroying for decades in their pursuit of artificial size. This bull was built for survival, for endurance, and for absolute efficiency. It was an animal that did not need heated barns, expensive grain rations, or constant veterinary care. It was the exact animal her grandfather had spent his life searching for, delivered to her farm by a stroke of bureaucratic incompetence. She kept the bull because she knew the experts were wrong. She kept him because she trusted the quiet, handwritten wisdom of her ancestor more than the loud, confident laughter of the auctioneer. The subsequent 2 years were a masterclass in patience and isolation. Vera named the bull Silas, a strong, old-fashioned name that suited his stoic demeanor. She turned him out into the pastures with her modest herd of 30 commercial cows. The neighboring farmers, men like Mr. Gable and Mr. Thornton, found endless amusement in her decision. When they gathered at the local diner or the feed store in town, Vera's bull was a frequent punchline. They joked that she was trying to breed a new type of dairy goat, or that she was planning to start a petting zoo. They pointed to their own massive, grain-fed bulls, animals that weighed over a ton and required daily buckets of rich feed just to maintain their bulk, and proudly declared that this was the only way to make a profit. Vera heard their jokes. She saw their condescending smiles, but she never argued. She simply went back to her farm, tightened her belt, and went to work. The reality of her decision meant that she was operating on a razor-thin margin. Because she had lost the capital she had invested in the premium bull, she had no money for commercial fertilizers or supplemental grain. She had to rely entirely on the natural productivity of her rocky pastures. The work was brutal and unrelenting. She spent the spring months mending miles of barbed wire fence by hand, her knuckles bleeding and calloused, moving the cattle in a strict rotational grazing pattern to maximize the sparse forage. In the summer, she cut hay with an aging, rusted tractor that broke down weekly, requiring her to spend hours covered in grease, referencing her grandfather's old service manuals to keep the machine running. She did not take a single day off. She did not buy new clothes. She ate beans and rice, stretched her meager budget to the absolute breaking point, and watched her herd. There was a night during the dead of winter in 1973 when the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero and a howling blizzard swept through the Green Mountains. The wind screamed through the cracks in the old wooden barn, driving fine, powdery snow into the center aisle. Vera was exhausted, shivering violently in a patched wool coat, carrying heavy buckets of water from the house because the pipes in the barn had frozen solid. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, and her bank account was virtually empty. As she poured the steaming water into the trough, she looked out into the dark pasture. The neighboring farmers had locked their delicate, expensive cattle inside heated barns, terrified of the cold. Vera's cattle were outside. For a brief, agonizing moment, doubt crept into her mind. The sheer weight of the isolation, the relentless physical pain, and the terrifying financial precariousness threatened to crush her. She wondered if the auctioneer had been right. She wondered if she was just a foolish, stubborn girl destroying her own life out of pride. But then, the moon broke through the heavy snow clouds, casting a pale silver light across the pasture. She saw Silas standing at the edge of the tree line. He was not shivering. He was not huddled in misery. He was standing calmly, his thick, primitive coat perfectly insulating his body, chewing his cud with absolute indifference to the lethal cold. Around him, the cows were bedded down in the snow, relaxed and comfortable, radiating heat. They were surviving exactly as her grandfather had written they would. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. She was right. The land remembered what the industry had forgotten. When the spring of 1974 arrived, the first crop of calves sired by Silas hit the ground. This is where the truth began to reveal itself, not in sudden, dramatic explosions, but in quiet, undeniable facts. In the modern cattle industry, calving season was a time of high stress and high mortality. The massive, blocky genetics of the commercial bulls often resulted in calves that were too large to be born naturally. Farmers routinely spent their nights pulling calves with mechanical chains, calling veterinarians for emergency surgeries, and losing both calves and mothers to the trauma of birth. But on Vera's farm, the calving season passed in silence. The calves were born small, slender, and incredibly vigorous. Because of the sloping pelvic structure they inherited from Silas, the cows delivered them effortlessly in the brush, without a single instance of human intervention. Within minutes of hitting the ground, the calves were on their feet, nursing aggressively, their survival instincts sharp and immediate. They did not have the massive, bulky frames of the neighbors' calves, but they possessed a dense, compact muscularity that was entirely different. They were structurally flawless. As the summer progressed, a severe drought settled over the region. The pastures turned brown and brittle. The neighbors, panic-stricken, began buying expensive truckloads of hay and grain to keep their heavy cattle from starving, driving themselves deeper into debt. Vera had no money for grain. Her cattle had to survive on the dry, scorched grass. And they did more than survive, they thrived. The calves grew at a steady, relentless pace, their bodies perfectly adapted to extract maximum nutrition from minimal forage. They did not succumb to the respiratory diseases that swept through the confined, stressed herds of the neighboring farms. They did not develop foot rot or pink eye. They were vibrant, healthy, and fiercely resilient. By the time autumn arrived and it was time to wean the calves, the undeniable reality of Vera's success could no longer be hidden. When she ran the calves across the community scales, the numbers defied conventional logic. Despite having eaten no grain and surviving a severe drought on marginal land, her calves were heavier, denser, and healthier than the heavily subsidized calves of her neighbors. The whispers in the county changed. The mockery stopped, replaced by a quiet, bewildered curiosity. Men who had laughed at her 2 years ago now parked their trucks on the shoulder of the road, leaning against the hoods, staring silently across the fence line at the strange, beautiful cattle grazing in Vera's fields. They could see the difference. They could see the structural integrity, the calm temperament, and the absolute health of the herd. Mr. Gable, the neighbor who had been the loudest in his ridicule, approached Vera at the hardware store. He took off his hat, looked down at his boots, and asked, in a low, humbled voice, what kind of grain she was feeding her animals to get them to look like that. Vera looked at him, her face calm and unreadable. She told him the truth. She fed them nothing but grass and water. He walked away shaking his head, unable to comprehend a success that completely contradicted the expensive lies he had been sold by the industry. The turning point of the story, the moment the world truly recognized what Vera had built, occurred the following year. A local veterinarian, amazed by the absolute lack of disease and the perfect structural health of Vera's herd, mentioned the cattle to a colleague at the State Agricultural University. A few weeks later, a team of university specialists arrived at the Dunning farm. They drove pristine white trucks bearing the university seal, and carried clipboards, measuring tapes, and blood testing kits. They were polite but skeptical, expecting to find a statistical anomaly or a farmer exaggerating her success. Vera did not try to convince them of anything. She simply opened the gates and let them walk among the herd. The specialists spent 3 days on the farm. They measured the pelvic angles of the cows, they weighed the forage, they took blood samples, and they observed the behavior of the animals. As the days passed, their skepticism dissolved into profound astonishment. The lead researcher, a man who had spent his entire career studying bovine genetics, sat at Vera's kitchen table, looking at the data sheets with wide eyes. He explained that the modern cattle industry had inadvertently created a genetic bottleneck. By selecting exclusively for massive size and rapid growth, they had bred out the traits necessary for natural survival, disease resistance, structural soundness, and forage efficiency. He told Vera that the DNA tests confirmed what her grandfather's journals had predicted. Silas, the unwanted scrub bull, was a direct descendant of a lost heritage bloodline, an isolated genetic pocket that had somehow survived untouched by the industry's interference. He carried the dominant traits of the original, hardy breeds that had settled the continent. The researcher looked at Vera with a mixture of awe and respect. He told her that she did not just have a good herd of cattle, she possessed a genetic gold mine. The industry, currently plagued by rising veterinary costs and failing animal health, was desperately searching for exactly these traits to reintroduce into the commercial gene pool. He told her that the offspring of Silas were worth millions to the right buyers. News of the university's findings spread through the agricultural community like a wildfire. The story of the young woman in the Green Mountains who had accidentally acquired a miracle bull became legendary. And naturally, the news reached the ears of Mr. Holloway at the auction house. 4 years after he had laughed at Vera on the telephone, a long black luxury car drove slowly down the rutted dirt driveway of the Dunning farm. Mr. Holloway stepped out, wearing a tailored suit and polished shoes that looked entirely absurd in the mud of the farmyard. He did not have his usual loud, confident swagger. He looked nervous, clutching a leather briefcase. He found Vera in the barn, quietly repairing a leather halter. She did not stop working when he approached. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat, attempting to muster his old authority, but his voice wavered. He launched into a practiced speech, talking about how the auction house had always seen potential in her operation, how they were proud to have been a part of her early success, and how they wanted to make things right. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a contract. He offered to buy Silas and his entire crop of male offspring for a sum of money that was staggering, a number that would have paid off Vera's mortgage 10 times over and allowed her to never work another day in her life. He offered to make her the official face of a new genetic breeding program, backed by the auction house's vast resources. Vera stopped her work. She laid the leather halter over the wooden fence and looked at Mr. Holloway. She remembered the sound of his laughter echoing through the telephone wire. She remembered the freezing nights carrying water, the hunger, the isolation, and the absolute certainty of the establishment that she was a fool destined for ruin. She looked at the polished shoes sinking into the mud of her barn, and then she looked out the open doors to the pasture, where Silas was grazing peacefully among his extraordinary offspring. She spoke softly, but her voice carried the heavy, immovable weight of the mountains. She reminded Mr. Holloway that he had told her the bull was a worthless scrub. She reminded him that he had promised she would be bankrupt before the snow melted. She told him that she did not need his money, she did not need his breeding program, and she certainly did not need his validation. She explained that she had built her herd using knowledge his industry had arrogantly discarded, and she had survived using a resilience his industry could not comprehend. She told him to put his contract back in his briefcase and to get off her land. Mr. Holloway stood in the center aisle of the barn, his face flushed red with a mixture of embarrassment and defeat. He realized in that moment that all his money and influence meant absolutely nothing here. He was standing in the presence of a master, a woman who had beaten the system not by fighting it, but by outlasting it, by knowing the truth of the land better than the men who claimed to own it. He slowly closed his briefcase, nodded his head in a silent, profound apology, and walked back to his luxury car. He drove away, leaving Vera in the quiet peace of her barn. She had wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in, and she had won entirely on her own terms. The subsequent decades proved the absolute brilliance of Vera's decision. As the commercial cattle industry continued to struggle with disease, rising feed costs, and the consequences of their extreme genetic manipulation, the Dunning farm became a beacon of sustainable, profitable agriculture. Ranchers from across the country, men who had finally realized the error of the modern ways, began arriving at her fence line. They did not come to mock her. They came to beg for the opportunity to purchase a single bull calf from her herd. Vera sold her genetics carefully, choosing only buyers who respected the animals and understood the philosophy of her grandfather. She dictated the terms, she set the prices, and she owned the bloodline entirely. She paid off the mortgage on the farm with a single, quiet check. She repaired the old barn, bought a new tractor, and expanded her acreage, never once taking out another loan from the bank. She operated completely free from the crushing cycle of debt that held her neighbors captive. While the men who had laughed at her slowly went bankrupt, forced to sell their family farms to corporate developers because they could not maintain the artificial demands of their oversized herds, Vera thrived. The land responded to her careful stewardship, the soil growing richer, the pastures thicker, supporting a herd of cattle that were entirely in harmony with their environment. Let me jump forward to the late 1990s. Vera Dunning was now a respected elder in the agricultural community. Her hair had turned silver, and her face bore the deep, weathered lines of a life spent outdoors, but her posture remained as straight and unyielding as the fence posts she had driven into the rocky soil decades ago. She was no longer the underestimated outsider. She was a quiet legend, a woman whose name was spoken with reverence in auction houses and university halls across the nation. Yet, despite her immense wealth and status, she had not changed. She still wore patched work coats, she still walked the pastures every morning, and she still relied on the leather-bound journals of Elias Dunning. One crisp autumn afternoon, a young university student, the grandson of one of the original researchers who had visited the farm, came to interview Vera for a thesis on heritage genetics. He sat at the same heavy oak table in the kitchen, his tape recorder running, surrounded by the quiet hum of the old farmhouse. He asked her a question that many had asked over the years. He asked her how she had known. How had a 24-year-old girl, drowning in debt and completely isolated, possessed the courage to look at an animal the entire world had deemed worthless and see a multi-million-dollar empire? Vera poured the young man a cup of black coffee, sat down across from him, and placed her hand on the cracked, fading cover of her grandfather's journal. She looked out the kitchen window, gazing at the distant tree line where the descendants of Silas were moving gracefully through the tall grass. The answer she gave him was not about market trends, or genetic sequencing, or business strategy. It was a statement of profound ancestral truth, a philosophy forged in the crucible of hard labor and quiet observation. She told the young man that the world is always rushing forward, always looking for the next shortcut, the next chemical, the next quick profit. She explained that the experts and the dealers believe they can outsmart nature, that they can mold the earth and its creatures, but the earth does not compromise. The land demands respect, it demands patience, and it demands integrity. She told him that she did not invent anything new. She simply remembered what everyone else had chosen to forget. Let me leave you with this thought. Have you ever stood alone, holding on to a truth that the entire world told you was a lie? Have you ever possessed the quiet strength to endure the laughter of the crowd, knowing that the foundation you were building was solid rock, while they were building on sand. The auctioneer told Vera Dunning to take the refund, to follow the crowd, to trust the system. He believed the animal was a mistake, but she kept the bull. She trusted the quiet wisdom of her ancestors, and the land remembered. Patience is not simply the ability to wait. It is the ability to maintain your vision while you are waiting. True wealth is not found in the quick, artificial gains of the crowd, but in the deep, enduring roots of knowledge, discipline, and absolute self-reliance.